All right, well, good evening and welcome to this evening's meeting of Citizens for Informed Land Use, or CILU. We are fortunate tonight to be hosting Sean Quinn from New Jersey American Water. I am Julie Roth. I'm the current president of CILU, and I have with me Bill Little, and there he is, and RG Malonis from the CILU board. So welcome. CILU is a community organization founded in 1998. This is our 27th year, to preserve home-built farmland and other open spaces and to protect the natural resources of our town, particularly our watershed. Our mission is also to give citizens the information they need to advocate for good government to ensure that we are effective at protecting the town that we love. CILU follows issues in town to identify what effect they will have on our quality of life in Homedale. Currently, we are watching development plans being presented for the former Vonage site on the southern side of Homedale. This property is firmly within our watershed, and the application before the planning board details the developer's plans to discharge treated wastewater directly to the Willowbrook, which feeds our swimming reservoir where we get our drinking water. So this evening is very timely, and we're very happy to have with us Sean Quinn from New Jersey American Water. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank CILU member and Assemblywoman Vicki Flynn for helping to put us in touch with Mr. Quinn. So Vicki, thank you very much for your help in this area. Now, Sean Quinn has over 7 years of experience in environmental health and safety, water quality management, and emergency response. He currently serves as Source Water Protection Program Manager at New Jersey American Water, where he leads initiatives to safeguard drinking water sources through proactive risk assessments, environmental monitoring, and regulatory compliance programs. Mr. Quinn's expertise spans environmental compliance, field investigation, and health and safety leadership. He shares our passion for environmental stewardship, and we are grateful to have him with us tonight. If you have questions for Mr. Quinn following his presentation, please put them in the Q&A. And I will stop and note right here that we do not have permission to record the Q&A portion of tonight, so I encourage you to stay with us all the way to the very end if you want to hear all of his responses. So Mr. Quinn, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us tonight, and welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for having me this evening to come and talk to your organization. As we just said, my name is Sean Quinn, and I'm a Source Water Protection Program Manager for American Water, serving the state of New Jersey. This evening, I'm here representing New Jersey American Water to talk to all of you about protecting our source waters. Prior to us getting started, I would just like to thank Sulu, Julie, and everyone on the board for allowing me to come and speak with you this evening. I would also like to thank all of you who are here for us. So right now, all 30 of you, pretty good turnout for 7:30 on a Tuesday, a Monday. So definitely really happy to see everybody here today. So, and then on top of that too, we'd also like to thank Vicki Flynn for getting all of us connected to provide this presentation. Prior to us getting started, one last remark. I would like to say that, New Jersey American Water was ranked #1 in customer satisfaction again for large water utilities in the Northeast region for our second year in a row by J.D. Power and Associates. So this evening, we're going to be talking about a few different topics. We're going to first go over a brief introduction as to who New Jersey American Water and who American Water are. We're then going to move into what is source water, talk about our watersheds, what is source water protection, the threats to source water protection planning, source water monitoring, and engaging our communities. So we have some pretty interesting topics this evening. American Water was founded in 1886. We're the largest regulated water and wastewater utility company in the United States, providing safe, clean, reliable, and affordable drinking water and wastewater services to more than 14 million people with regulated operations in 14 states and on 18 military installations. Across all of that geographical area, American Water employs over 6,700 talented professionals who leverage their significant experience and the company's national size to achieve excellent outcomes for the benefit of our customers, employees, investors, and other stakeholders. Taking that large category and breaking it down, New Jersey American Water is the largest regulated water and wastewater service provider in the state of New Jersey. We serve approximately 860 employees across the state, which boils down to 2.9 million people across 18 counties. At this moment in time, we are in every county except for Cumberland, Hudson, and Sussex County. That then turns into 727,000 water service customers and 74,700 wastewater service customers across the footprint of New Jersey alone. And all of that takes significant infrastructure. The sources of supply here in New Jersey are 89% surface water, 10% groundwater, and 1% purchased water. That breaks down to 7 surface water treatment plants, 3 of which located here in Monmouth County, 228 total ground wells, and 25 wastewater treatment plants. And believe it or not, that's a lot of miles of pipe below our feet, equating to 10,448 miles of water main and 726 miles of wastewater main. So as you can imagine, we are very busy across the board with all kinds of different topics. And on top of that, we're a community partner. And American Water and our charitable foundation takes pride in community outreach and doing all kinds of general activities to help support our communities we serve. Our American Water Charitable Foundation supports communities through its Water and Environment Grant. This grant focuses on clean water, conservation, environmental education, climate variability, and water-based recreation. We have our Speakers Bureau, where we provide presentations on water-related topics, like we're doing this evening for everyone here. We have a volunteer firefighting support grant, which provides grants of up to $2,500 to assist volunteer emergency service organizations. We have our community advocacy grant program, which supports projects and promotes equal opportunity and representation within all of our communities. We have a bottle filling grant program, which provides grants of up to $2,500 to purchase water bottle filling stations, for eligible organizations. We have our Protect Our Watershed art contest, and I would be biased if I wouldn't say this is one of my favorites here. But it's open to all 6th graders, and this contest encourages students to utilize their artistic talents to express the importance of protecting our water resources. And I'll tell you, some of these children have amazing abilities. We have our newly created Girl Scout patch program. It's the first of its kind here in New Jersey, and a patch program focuses on protecting drinking water sources and discovering water industry careers. And finally, we have our workforce development program, which connects young adults from underdeserved populations with training and career opportunities for all different aspects of life. But at the end of the day, what we're really here to talk about is source water and how we can protect our sources of supply here in New Jersey and throughout many other states that we serve. So one of the first questions that I really like to ask communities and individuals I get to speak with on a day-to-day basis is, where does your water come from? And it's really interesting because I get a lot of really different responses throughout all of the organizations I get to connect with. And I think one of my favorite responses I got from a group of grade school students recently was, it's magic. And it was really, really interesting to just hear that perspective because, from young children all the way up to, older adults, there almost is a slight disconnect about that water and how it gets from point A to point B all the way to the consumer. There are extremely talented professionals that are involved all the way from source water protection. So prior to that water entering a treatment plant, through the treatment process, through the analytical monitoring, the lab testing, reporting, and then going all the way to the distribution system and all the way to our consumers. So source water is the raw water that is used as a supply for drinking water. And we are really passionate about, really just ensuring that our water keeps flowing. And we have watersheds. And it's really important to remember that we all live in a watershed. Whether we remember it or not, it's something that I live and I die by. And a watershed is a land area that contributes flow to a given surface water body. In other words, water that falls within that area ultimately drains to a common point or a larger body of water. A watershed area is defined by topographic boundaries that control the direction of flow from high points to low points. So, a great example is mountain ranges, for example, would represent that boundary between two watersheds, where water falls on one side of the ridge would flow one direction, and water that falls on the other goes the opposite direction. So it's that geographical area that rainfall, snowmelt drains into a common outlet, such as a single river, lake, ocean, single point. And one of the easiest ways that I like to describe it to people is think of it like a big mixing bowl. You have these high points around the edges where that is that watershed divide. It's the top of that ridge or that mountain range, and all of that water flows down, is directed into the center of a bowl. And watersheds exist at many, many different scales. And it can be small as your backyard creek to large enough to encompass land that drains all the way down to the ocean, like the Delaware River. So, as I said, but when we started this slide, we all live in a watershed. And properly managing the land within that watershed is incredibly important to help sustain the quality and quantity of our water resource, not only for today, but for our generations to come. Watershed delineation is extremely important for sources of drinking water for drinking water supply because it helps us define the land area that contributes water to the source. In this context, as you can see here on the image of the slide, we're going to be going through a very small scenario of delineating a watershed. So that intake is really that downstream point of interest. And we would delineate from that intake, the star on the screen, all the way up the boundaries of that watershed. And we can really use that information and that area to help target our protection efforts for that specific geographical area. So as you can see here, our watershed delineation boundary is really that dotted line. And then we come to find out through other forms of delineation, we're able to kind of refine that to the image on the right. Now, another way for delineating watersheds is using the hydrological unit codes or HUC codes. So these are numerical codes that identify drainage areas. And this is something that is for every state across the board. And it's a unique code that identifies a specific location and a boundary of a hydrological unit. Think of it as like a zip code for a geographical area, but just for your watershed. The numbers of these digits of the HUC determine the scale of the watershed, which larger numbers of digits representing smaller delineations and smaller numbers representing larger areas of delineation. So a 2-digit would be your region or almost like a state type level, down to 12 digits, which is your sub watershed. If you're interested in learning a lot more about HUC codes or what HUC code you might fall under, I would highly recommend you go visit the United States Geological Survey, where they're really able to, provide a lot of great information and resources to find that information out. Also, a lot of your state's geological surveys or environmental agencies may have additional information for you to determine what hydrological unit code your area might fall under. And surface water. Surface water is defined as all of that water that collects on the surface of the earth. So we've defined our watershed in our last slide. So now we're kind of looking at all those surface waters inside. And there's a few different ways in which we can kind of look at surface water. The first is streams, which are bodies of water that flow within the beds or the banks of a channel. These can be free-flowing or regulated by flow control structures such as dams, locks, and things of that nature. And when we look at the Delaware River, for example, that is a large river system that's controlled for flood mitigation, recreation, drinking water, water supplies, navigation, commerce, and many, many other activities. So it's not necessarily just that real small, tiny tributary, it's these massive bodies of water. We have lakes and reservoirs, which are another type of surface water. These are impoundments or bodies of water contained within a certain area or boundary. Like streams, these can be natural or developed and controlled by man. We have wetland areas where land is saturated with so much water. It's a marsh, it's a swamp. And these areas have a really unique ability to filter nutrients and other contaminants and can even improve water quality over time. However, they are also considered protected ecosystems, and they're not always available or appropriate to use for drinking water sources. And finally, we have oceans, which are bodies of saline water that make up the majority of the Earth. When we get a little bit further down the line of our presentation this evening, we'll kind of go over water availability and some water scarcity topics. So we will revisit oceans, but there are parts in the world and even in the U.S. where freshwater resources are limited, and the primary form of drinking water is actually desalinated water, and that's their only available option. However, the desalination process is extremely energy intensive, and it's also extremely expensive to treat saline water. So when we have the availability in sufficient amount of fresh water, that's obviously our most go-to topic and source of supply. However, we can do saline. Here in New Jersey, we use many, many different sources of supply. And when we think about this, we pass by them every day, we recreate on them. And some of our systems have a single source of supply, while others have a combination of sources to meet demand or address operational challenges. Sources are selected extremely early on in the operation and planning sections for a water system. And all of that is to ensure that the availability, proximity, and quality of water. There's two main types of sources that the majority of our water comes from. You have surface water and you have groundwater. Here in New Jersey, some of the sources of surface water that we use are the Manasquan Reservoir, Spruce Run, and Round Valley. Both of those reservoir systems can be seen up in the top. They're owned and managed by the New Jersey Water Supply Authority. We have the Raritan Millstone River systems, we have the Delaware River, and we have the DNR Canal. However, that's not all of them. That's just a quick snippet of the surface water sources we have here in New Jersey. And also, it's really important that these waters, for the most part, are open for recreational purposes. And sometimes there is some limitations. So just ensure that you're doing everything appropriately based on your recreation activities. And groundwater. Groundwater is defined as water that collects below the surface of the earth in spaces between soil or rock materials in the subsurface. A geological formation that contains and moves groundwater is called an aquifer. In loose soil, such as sands or silts, water collects and moves in between the grains like it were to do so if you filled a bathtub with sand and poured water into it and let it seep through. That's something that's similar. You can see up there in image A, well-sorted sands. That's kind of how that roughly would work. In rock and groundwater, more commonly flows through fractures along paths of least resistance, like you would flow down a crack in your driveway or in the sidewalk. Groundwater occurs in the pore space of geological formations, and there's two types of porosity that can occur. We have primary porosity, which refers to the openings that formed at the same time as rock, such as the pores in well-sorted, unconsolidated sands, and secondary porosity, which refers to the openings that formed after a rock was formed, such as fractures in granite or solution cavities in limestone. You can kind of see those two areas of secondary porosity in figures B and C from the USGS. And there's two main sources of groundwater that's used for drinking water supplies. So we have springs, which is groundwater that naturally flows from the surface at an intersection point, such as a hillside or a valley. And I'm pretty sure that you've seen them in your life. Sometimes it's just a pipe sticking out of a mountain, or it's just a rock face that's naturally seeping that water. And then we have wells, which are structures created in the ground to access water in subsurface aquifers. And there's two different types of wells. We have unconfined aquifers, which typically rise and fall with, water usage, water discharge, water recharge. And an easy form of a unconfined well that you might see is, if you remember, those wells that have a rope and a handle and a crank, and you pull up that water via a bucket. A lot of times those are, unconfined aquifers. And then we have our confined aquifers, which typically have a layer of confining material above and below. More often than not, those are in rock cavities, or they're also known as they'll have clay layers above and below. And those layers are really just impermeable material. Finally, when it comes to drilling a well, if you do elect to drill a well, you're in the well drilling business, you want to make sure that you're following all applicable regulations and standards. These are put in place by government agencies to protect aquifers and drinking water sources from cross-contamination. We have our groundwater supply. So here in New Jersey, approximately 30% of our drinking water supply is derived from groundwater. That statistic is coming from the New Jersey DEP. We're not going to go too much into our overall bedrock aquifer, geology here. But the principal coastal plains aquifer is the Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifer system. So that's, most of South Jersey. And then north of the fall line is the principal aquifers consist of glacial valley fill deposits, fractured shales, mudstone, limestone, shalestone, and other forms of geological structures. And these aquifers include the glacial valley fill aquifer, the Newark group aquifers, carbonate aquifers within the valley and ridge sedimentary units, and the indigenous and metamorphic crystalline rock structures that can be found in the highlands. So earlier in our presentation, a few slides before, we spoke about watershed delineation. And groundwater delineation is pretty similar when it's compared to surface waters, in that it defines an area that contributes flow to groundwater source. It is different, though, that these boundaries are controlled by subsurface pressures and flow conditions rather than surface topographies. So there's two types of zones that commonly delineate groundwater. We have the zone of influence, which we're going to talk about that here on figure 22-1, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. So that zone of influence is the area around a well. So imagine we've drilled a well, the casing is in there, we have our pump in the ground, and we're ready to flip that well on. And for this example, we're not going to have necessarily, soil or earthen material on top. So it's almost like we have a piece of plexiglass. And once that pump is turned on, what we're going to see is this cone of depression form. And that cone of depression is going to be represented by the dashed circle lines on that figure on the left, and then that final cone of depression kind of on the outside. So as that pump kicks on, we start drawing more and more water from the aquifer, and our pump is finally at full capacity. When you're peering straight down, what you end up seeing is almost like a cone of depression that's surrounding that well. And when you look down, it looks like you're looking at a cone upside down with that sheer circle tapering down to a point. And that's really where you're going to see a lot of your water come from, and that's kind of how they outline the zone of influence. There's a lot of math and other things that go into actually understanding how that's defined, but that's the easiest way to explain what that zone of influence looks like. And next we have the zone of contribution. Now, the zone of contribution can be seen better in figure 2-2. Right up at the top, you'll see zone of contribution with the arrows pointing down to dashed lines. So we have that well that's on, that well is pumping, but that zone of contribution is around the cone of depression. And what that's taking into account for is the pumping rate, but as well as the recharge areas beyond the zone of influence. And that contributes water to the well under natural flow conditions. So it's helpful to delineate these areas for zone and flow conditions so that we understand potential impacts and availability and quality of groundwater. Also, this helps us understand if there is some type of impact to groundwater. We're able to, understand if those challenges would affect our wells, not affect our wells, and things like that. And that's where we have, geologists and hydrologists and things like that to really help, the scientific end of those challenges. So we've talked about watersheds, we've talked about groundwater a little bit, some of our aquifers, but now we're going to kind of get into what is source water protection. And it's another question that I do like to ask people as to what they think source water protection is. And I also like to ask a question as part of this slide as to, what do you do or what do you think you do as of part of source water protection prior to us going through their slides. So as we continue to work through this presentation, we're going through the material, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind and see, if your activities or your thought processes are kind of aligning with, some of the approaches that I've taken, as well as, other people in the industry, internal or external to New Jersey American Water have taken. So source water protection is a multi-barrier approach. One of the easier ways to describe it is think of it as the first step in the treatment process. So looking at the image here on the screen, all the way to the left, we have this nice pristine reservoir or riverine system, which then leads into a surface water treatment plant and then portions of the distribution system and finally into the consumer's hands or the consumer's glass, as I like to say sometimes. So it involves identifying and working to mitigate potential risks, to maintain and improve the quantity and the quality of drinking water sources. It is an important part of our multi-barrier approach, along with our transmission and distribution systems, to provide that quality drinking water for our consumers. And when we do source water protection, there is potentially some cost savings that could happen to all parties involved, and those cost savings can look a little bit different depending on where you are. But if you can partner with and have those proactive partnerships and work with many different groups of people, you may be able to improve the quality of water prior to it getting to the treatment plant, which then can help lower costs for everybody. Now, it's not always possible to protect our water bodies in the strict sense of the term protect. And the reason for that is most of the time, we as a utility may not have the regulatory authority, or we do not have the regulatory authority to control or limit others' actions. We may not have the controls to restrict use or access to bodies of water. So when you think of that term protect, it's a little bit different. So we are doing source water protection, but we can't cordon off certain things or, have regulatory authority. So what is source water protection really about? It's more about building resiliency, building relationships so that we can work together with individual consumers, other organizations to reduce the likelihood that a source issue occurs and at the same time reducing the impact of what if an event does occur. So the approaches to source water protection. Think of it like a circle. You can hop in at any step of the source water protection of this graphic here, and you can start in many different areas. So if you wanted to start with education and outreach and then hop over to collaborative partnerships and then go to local ordinances and bylaws, you certainly can do that. But you kind of have these three main, outer, the tire of the wheel, and then we get into more of the spokes of the rim. So, and then, we have monitoring, inspections, land use controls, all of this great, approaches for source water protection. It's extremely important to have collaborative partnerships and agreement across the board for source water protection. It's a really important approach. So because of that, we're going to kind of start in that spoke first with monitoring and inspections. So monitoring and inspections is developing and updating contaminant inventories. It's monitoring and tracking contaminant sources based on the contaminant inventory over time. And a lot of times a contaminant inventory and tracking is done in a GIS, so a geographical information system, software, or some type of product. So the easiest way to look at that monitoring inspection is you're driving around town and you've now come across a new business that's opened shop. You've never seen this business before, so you go home and you hop on the internet and you do a little bit of understanding, and you find out that there's a new transportation company that's opened up on an industrial portion of town. From looking at Google Earth and things like that, you're able to see they have a lot of tractor trailers and industrial trucks. You can see that they have a tank for diesel fuel. So now you're like, okay, they have trucking, so they might have tire wear or tire use. They may have petroleum-based products, whether that's diesel fuels or DEF fluid. They could potentially have oils, antifreezes, things like that. So you're starting to build that inventory, and you're kind of saying, okay, I roughly know where these things are located. And then from there, you can start looking to see, what type of protection measures might be, applicable for that example. So one of those things could be land use controls and land management. So what that means is you could be working with the landowner to implement responsible land and agricultural management practices. The United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources, Conservation Services provides significant technical and financial support for land management activities every year. They also have implementation measures targeted at controlling erosion and sediment loading. For example, through built infrastructure, improved land management, stewardship, good housekeeping practices, things of that nature. And some individuals may also look at purchasing or obtaining conservation easements. That's not something that necessarily is done on the utility end in terms of purchasing land. So I can't necessarily field anything on that topic. You have wastewater, stormwater, and septic management systems. So we can do education for customers on Septic Smart Week, which is a week done by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And they do a lot of best management practices for maintaining your septic systems, ensuring that, individuals with a septic system know to get them inspected and cleaned at, a certain frequency, and all types of good warning signs as to when to potentially get them inspected or replaced, and working with, appropriate, professionals who do those types of services. You can improve stormwater management, green or gray infrastructure, and minimizing impervious areas. So with those land use controls and stormwater management, you could potentially look at, installing buffer strips or things like that to allow for better capture of sediments or runoff or nutrients and things like that to kind of help stop that loading into a body of water. We have wildlife controls, which is repelling birds and wildlife from source waters. And a lot of times people will use decoys, fencing, They use geese patrols at a lot of golf courses where they may have border collies or labs running around, to kind of scare off the geese. One of my favorite things I like to do is educating communities on pet waste management. This is really important because that can help limit bacteria and pathogens into the water. So if you've ever seen us out at an event doing community outreach or things like that, we typically have little blue dog bag bones or dog waste bags that are shaped like bones. Excuse me. They're definitely a hot button topic for giveaways and things like that when we're out in the communities. We have built infrastructure, so green infrastructure, including the construction of wetland stream bank restorations, vegetation buffer strips, detention and retention ponds can all be used as areas for source water protection. You have gray or constructed infrastructure devices, including drainage and treatment systems for wastewater disposal at industrial facilities and wet weather storage facilities. And we have emergency preparedness and response. So this is really important. So it's coordinating with your local officials who may be responsible for spill prevention or control measures. It's establishing and documenting clear emergency response procedures for water system personnel and coordinating response networks within the community and our neighbors and other systems and emergency responders so that we're all on the same page. Emergency response is extremely important. And, kind of in this example of there's a new business in town, not all of these approaches are kind of applicable to that example. But, we understand that there might, at this, the fake example we're giving of, a new, transportation business, they could have a release of a fuel oil, of a petroleum type product, and understanding when that happens, what built infrastructure is there, what natural riparian buffers or buffer zones we have, can all help kind of slow that down, and kind of limit impact to a body of water. Obviously, there would still be some, ground cleanup and things like that would potentially have to occur. But when you're working with these emergency response individuals, whether it's the fire department, the police department, your local office of emergency management, the DEP or federal agencies, the more advanced notice you have of a release, whether it's permitted or unpermitted, will certainly allow for a better defensive posture and better corrective measures to be taken. And as I said earlier, we have collaborative partnerships and incentives. And these are so essential to build source water protection and manage and implement and oversee all of these activities. Because source water protection at the end of the day takes a village. Not one individual or one organization can do it. There's so many great and powerful organizations out there with passionate people who do source water protection, and they do it with a lot of heart and a lot of passion, but also working alongside a variety of other organizations. And finally, we have stakeholder outreach and education. It's dedicated outreach and education incentives, and they're critical for obtaining buy-in and participation. And that outreach and education should target our stakeholders directly and those specifically who could be affected by source water protection activities, and for those who could serve as advocates for source water protection initiatives, like all of us here this evening. And what that all boils down to is the approaches to source water protection really kind of help us understand the threats to our source water, and what some of those associated risks may be. So, source water risks. And what are the potential risks for our sources of supply? One of the most common risks that we've come across for all of our systems and most utilities in general is the potential for a contamination event of the water supply. And these kind of fall under two main categories: point source and non-point source. Point source pollution occurs when a single defined location, such as a transportation spill, wastewater plant, discharge, mining operation, a leaking storage tank, releases that material. A lot of times those are permitted activities, which we'll go over in the next slide. We also have contamination which events which result from non-point source, which can occur over a broad area, such as nutrients from agriculture. And excuse me, I'm jumping ahead here. My apologies for that. And those occur over a broad period of time, from agricultural storm runoff, atmospheric deposition, and these contamination events from point source or non-point source can be immediate and acute, or which you'll see in the cases of a release, or they could be chronic as levels build generally over time. Now, what you'll see is one of the main risks that we see with our source water is climate. So when we first look at flooding has happened throughout history. And we've seen recently here in New Jersey that we've had a lot of significant flooding events, such as the remnants of Hurricane Ida. We've also had a lot of these significant rain events that have occurred this year where we've seen significant flooding across New Jersey. And what is that flooding? It's just an overabundance of rain and precipitation. But then that flooding seems to be followed by periods of drought where we don't have enough rain, we don't have enough precipitation. And those two topics then turn around to create an environment which allows for a plethora of rain. We have vegetation, undergrowth shoot up like crazy. We have all this new growth from shrubs to trees to plants that then are very susceptible because their root structures are quite small. They're fragile. We have periods of drought. They're then dormant, or they're no longer viable organisms, and some type of unfortunate man-made accident, or we have an issue with lightning or things like that, and we end up with a wildfire or a brush fire, which then can impact our source water risks. So climate change, that seasonality or year-to-year change is a pretty major risk to our sources of supply and our source water. So that water availability may also be an issue if there's limits for permitted withdrawals or other components used that could significantly limit the amount of water that can be withdrawn from like an aquifer or a reservoir, especially in areas where we have high demand. We can also see that here in the state of New Jersey. We're one of the most densely populated states. So that could be a challenge that we could face at some point in time. Now, as I already gave everybody a little, snidbit of our point source, non-point source slide. Our point source is a single identifiable localized source from which pollutants are discharged into the environment. Typically, those are regulated by the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is the federal standard and system, or the state level. Here in New Jersey, we use the state level. So the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection regulates the New Jersey Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, new GIPDs permits. And these permits set limits on the pollutants that facilities can discharge. There's requirements for various entities and parts of that permit, including the industry, the municipalities, other facilities, in terms of monitoring and reporting procedures and things like that. So there are significant, standards in place from the federal and the state level government for point source pollution that has a new GIPDs permit. We then have non-point sources, which we described earlier, and it's runoff from rain, snowmelt that can carry pollutants like sediment, fertilizers, toxic substances like oils or pesticides, herbicides, pathogens from animal waste, pet waste, and other pollutants such as road salt. So what are the sources of contamination? Well, there's many of them. So first we have microbial contaminants, which are viruses and bacteria, and they can come from sewage treatment plants, septic systems, agricultural livestock operations, and wildlife. We have inorganic contaminants such as salts and metals, which can be naturally occurring. They can come from stormwater, industrial and domestic wastewater discharges, oil and gas, mining, all that type of production. We have pesticides and herbicides, which can come from a variety of sources like stormwater runoff, residential uses, lawns, things of that nature. We have organic contaminants, which are synthetic or volatile organic compounds that are typically a byproduct of industrial processes like petroleum, oil and gas, things of that. And then we have radioactive contaminants, which can be occurring naturally or from a result of industry. Not all of these contaminants are occurring all over the place. They're monitored for and things of that nature, but every system is a little bit different in which contaminants they potentially could see. Now, a lot of these contaminants they have regulations, and we're going to talk briefly about some of those regulations. This is a disclaimer. It's not all of the regulations. It's only a quick portion. There's a lot of federal and state regulations that fall under these categories. But some of the bigger guys we have our Safe Drinking Water Act, which is the federal law passed in 1974 to protect public health by regulating public drinking water supplies. That law was then amended in 1986 and 1996 to include actions of protecting water at its sources. In 1999, the New Jersey DEP published the New Jersey Source Water Assessment Program Plan and completed all assessments of community and non-community water systems in 2004. And then some of our state regulations that we have are the New Jersey DEP encourages very strongly the development of plans for protecting drinking water. However, there's no state-specific requirement for a source water protection planning beyond the federal Safe Drinking Water Act. And then you have administrative codes in New Jersey, and some of those codes are going to be standards for construction and developing of groundwater sources and construction and development of surface water sources and groundwater sources under the direct influence of surface water. To get a full list of all the rules and regulations at the state or the federal level, I highly recommend you to go to, either the NJDEP, where they have listservs and things like that, and you can get updated via email on all types of rule and regulation changes and updates. And also visit, the EPA, as they will have a lot of good rules and regulations that may have not been covered under this small portion of tonight's presentation. So, potential contaminant sources. We've kind of talked about a lot of these different things this evening, but these sources are the most common threats that our communities could potentially face in terms of water quality to the sources of supply. And there's hundreds of thousands of unique chemicals and compounds that are being used, stored, and transported through our watersheds every single day. And I'm sure right now, if we decide to look at our watches and, go take a peek out on the parkway, we certainly would see some things, being transported around, and we may not know what they are. And some of these chemicals are well studied. And some of them we really don't have a lot of great information on for various reasons. But unfortunately, that's just kind of how that works at, a research and development and proprietary level. So the types of potential contaminants present in any given location is typically correlated to land use, and more specifically, the type of activity is occurring in that area. And that's why it's extremely important when we were talking about earlier developing inventories and understanding our watersheds, because what this will do will allow us to be more resilient and more prepared for what is potentially in our water systems, in our land use areas. So looking at this image on the screen, we can see we have a variety of different, land use areas, from a landfill, which could have a, defective liner that could be, or a failing leachate system that could potentially be discharging material. You have gas stations and underground storage tanks that potentially could have some type of rupture. We have agricultural challenges, which could be bacterial, or they could be nutrient loadings. We have industry, which could be chemical or manufacturing type things. And we also could have, those unknowns, those spill incidents that potentially could, discharge an unpermitted chemical that, until we get more information from regulators. So the more we understand about our overall land use, the more resilient we all as a community can be. So as promised, we're now going to talk about a little bit of water availability. And so this is one of my favorite things to talk about on this slide because, it's mind-boggling to me that we have 97% of our water on our earth is saline water. So it's not readily available for drinking water. So we have 3% that's considered fresh water and that we can potentially use as a source of supply. However, about 69% of that 3% is ice caps and glaciers and water that's either A, geographically not possible to get to, or, it's just frozen and unavailable for use. So then we have 30% being groundwater, 0.9% other, and then 0.3% surface water. And then that surface water is broken down into 87% lakes, 11% swamps, marshes, so we can't really use that. So of that 3% of water that is considered surface water, we may only be able to use about 89% of that 0.3%, which is a pretty staggering number, especially when you put it into the perspective of these large bodies of water we have in the United States, like the Great Lakes. And that challenges that water availability is not evenly distributed across the earth. And we see that, on this map that's coming up here, that it's just very, very, lopsided at times. And what are the risks that we face here? So this map in this figure is produced by the World Water Resource Institute to assess global water risk. And what we see is we have our lower end, low medium as yellow, yellowish orange, all the way up to the high end, that's, extreme high, that dark, that red, dark red. And, when we look here in New Jersey, we're more of that like low to medium low for, water availability. But then if we move over to, the the Pacific South, so California, Mexico area, it's, even in the Colorados, it's a lot more deep red. We have a lot of water availability, and, that's really, partially driven by climate. It's partially driven by rainfall, by population. But what you'll see is that these areas where we have typically a large volume of water availability, we also have very dense populations. So there can be the argument that, water availability and population density are highly correlated, but we'll leave that to other experts for another time. And what that all ends up falling into is source water monitoring. So what is source water monitoring? And why do we do source water monitoring? Well, there's many of reasons. One of them is we do it to better understand the raw water conditions for our routine operations and water treatment. We can also use it to identify potential changes that could indicate the possibility of a contaminant or a contamination incident. Now, when you look at all of these things, there's a lot of different forms of source water monitoring. You can do visual monitoring. So you can go to a body of water and you can look at it and say, oh, all the way to the left, that looks a little green. Is there an algae problem? Is it some other issue that's going on? Or is it potentially just reflectance from the vegetation? You then could go to the middle and we could go to the United States Geological Survey, and we could be looking at historical data over the past, several days or 30 days to kind of see what that water quality means. We can also look to our field service personnel who could be doing, real-time water quality monitoring in the field with instrumentation purposes. And all that's there is to kind of help us further investigate and further understand the quality of our water prior to it coming to our treatment plants. Now, we also have the availability of real-time source water monitoring panels, and all of our plants here in New Jersey and many of them in other states have source water monitoring panels. And what information do we expect to get out of these? What value do these provide us? And we're looking at indicator parameters. So they're telling us the general characteristics of the raw water. And it's not intended to tell us what specific compounds are in our water. If there's equipment out on the market that could reliably test for any type of contaminant and at a reasonable cost, we would certainly consider that. But there's a lot of limited options, availability, and other factors for this type of applicable real-time monitoring, like you would see with a GCMS, one may say. So what we do is we look for those changes in water quality, these parameters shown here, and they're going to either tell us that we're seeing a natural or a seasonality change, or it's a result of something else that's going on in the water body that would potentially prompt us to investigate further with, validatable analytical sampling. So these are some of the common real-time monitoring probes that you would potentially see in not only, a source water monitoring panel, but, many organizations who are monitoring water, such as the DRBC or the New Jersey Water Supply Authority or other like headwater associations. So they're going to be looking at pH, which is going to tell us our hydrogen ion concentration, and it's going to let us know if we're acidic, which is about 5 or less. We might, whether we're neutral around 7, or basic, which would be about 10 or over. They'd be looking at conductivity, which is going to tell us the capacity to conduct an electrical current through dissolved ions. Temperature, ORP, which is oxidation reduction potential, which is the tendency to gain or lose electrons. Dissolved oxygen, which is the important factor for chemical reactions. It can lead us to indicate possible, algal challenges. We could be seeing challenges with fish populations or other biological material, and in terms of organisms like bacteria or things like that. Turbidity, which is the suspended solids. Refined fuels, which is a petroleum indicator, and it is not specific to any type of, individual compound. And then total algae, like phycocyanin or chlorophyll. So there's a lot of good indicating parameters that could, help us point us in an analytical method where we would have lab results. And finally, we have dashboards. And we utilize them all the time. I look at dashboards every day. So we have the United States Geological Survey water dashboards. Throughout the United States, there's probably thousands of individual USGS gauges on bodies of water. And many of these have decades of data that is available to show water quality generationally. And some of them might have only 1 or 2 parameters, such as total passing flow or temperature, where others may have, probes such as conductivity, dissolved oxygen, pH, phycocyanin, or chlorophyll. There's also certain images and monitors that you'll see that actually have the availability for cameras. So you can go back and look at live, images and live video of that body of water, which can help you understand if you see, a spike in one of the graphs and you say, oh, that's different. And then you can actually have a historical image of potentially what happened. You can't guarantee it's going to be captured, but there's always a chance. For New Jersey, we have the New Jersey DEP algal bloom sampling dashboard, which is monitored and updated by the DEP and their scientists. And that's going to have general location points based on green to red, or green to black, for no hab present, watch, warning, advisory. And that's going to tell you based on the conditions of algal cell count and things like that, and whether a body of water may be closed to certain activities or not. We have the New Jersey DEP continuing monitoring buoy program, very similar to the USGS gauges, but this is done by the NJDEP and Rutgers, I believe. And these are really nice because it gives you a nice little needle and it tells you your ranges from green, yellow, and red to see if you're visually in the right area. They have the flyover algal bloom surveillance, where they're using remote sensing and a small wing aircraft to fly over bodies of water and look at reflectance to understand possible cell counts that can then be ground truthed with analytical data. And then finally, we have the New Jersey GeoWeb. And that GeoWeb is a great database with all kinds of historical data from land use to contaminated sites to some sampling results to, some water quality information. So there's certainly a lot of dashboards available at the community and the public's fingertips to, help further or understand their current source water quality in their communities. And finally, engaging our communities. Community education is huge when it comes to source water protection, as we've alluded throughout this. And a lot of that is, from my experience and what I've seen is that there's many members of the community that is unaware of the true cost and the dedication and the hard work that goes into treating and delivering clean, safe, and reliable water. I can tell you I've never worked with a more passionate group of individuals day in and day out. And as a part of our mission, for our source water program and source water protection in general, is to help educate our customers about the water cycle, watershed, source water protection, and best management practices. We provide all kinds of information, such as one-pagers, which can be found on the New Jersey American Water webpage, YouTube videos on our YouTube channel, social media posts on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We also have our speaking engagements to educate the community of the importance of source water protection. And a lot of other good information can be found on the New Jersey American Water Learning Center. So with that, I want to leave everybody with, we all live in a watershed, and we can all help to protect that watershed, because at the end of the day, the goal is to ensure that future generations are still going to be able to have clean, safe, and reliable drinking water to use and consume daily, recreate on, and just overly enjoy for generations to come. And with that, I would like to thank all of you this evening for listening to me talk for the last hour. My email address is on the screen. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to shoot me an email, and I will do my best to, respond to you in an appropriate amount of time. You can also visit the New Jersey American Water webpage for additional information about the organization, consumer confidence reports, source water protection information, and there's also a link on that source water protection website with a form you can fill out, which you can ask questions and things like that, and that can certainly find its way to the right department through that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. That was a tremendous presentation, as is your job, as we got a little sneak peek into there. And I have to compliment you on your graphics. You take some really complicated concepts and processes and made them so much easier to understand. So just thank you for all of that information. And what you do is central to our mission. We want to be educated so that we can be better advocates for our watershed. So thank you for equipping us for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So as I said earlier, we are going to stop the recording so that we can move into our question and answer portion. So I hope everyone sticks around. Some people have written some very good questions into the chat, some thoughtful questions. So you may continue writing questions as we go through this, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I will stop the recording right now.